Spend some time with our friend Kristen McQueary from the Chicago Tribune's editorial board, also a Rockford native. Kristen, good morning.
Go Guilford.
How you doing this morning?
Great. How are you?
Doing pretty well. I am after a White Sox victory yesterday. Those have been too few and far between this season.
I know. It really made my day after, torturing myself by watching the legislature live streaming on my computer to then learn that the Sox won.
Although, most Sox games have been somewhat torturous this year. A couple of big topics to discuss, Kristen. The budget battle continues in Springfield. The deadline's supposed to be this weekend. Doesn't look like, they might put something in front of the governor, nothing he would necessarily sign. Are you surprised at all that Mike Madigan, House Speaker, he's a smart guy. John Cullerton, Senate President, he generally follows the lead of a smart guy. Are you surprised they want to put their members on the record voting for a budget that's $4 billion underfunded when Governor Rauner and allies have more than $30 million to spend informing taxpayers that's just what they did?
Am I surprised? I guess a little bit, but when you look at the bigger picture, the gamble that they're taking is passing an underfunded budget and seeing if taxpayers are outraged by that, which generally people aren't paying that close attention, versus giving Rauner an unbalanced budget that he now has to go through and make all of those ugly and painful cuts, or he has to veto it outright. So I think the gamble that they're taking is that it's better for the members to be, looking as if they're trying to fund social service programs and then laying it in Rauner's lap to actually make the tough cuts.
Governor Rauner, though, strikes me, and along with the people in his orbit, are people who aren't going to necessarily take this one lying down, are going to make sure that, if blame is being cast about, that they'd kind of like you to maybe throw it in the direction they think is proper.
Right. I don't know that Rauner should be surprised at all, but the legislature passing a completely out-of-whack, unbalanced budget for the second year in a row is basically extending a giant middle finger to him right now. He came to the table. I'm told the three, Madigan, Cullerton, and Rauner met about a week and a half ago, and the Democrats are just unwilling to give on anything. They're not going to give on, he has this laundry list of stuff that he wants, and he's even taken off the table some of the more controversial right-to-work enterprise zones. But term limits, redistricting, things that are popular with voters, he wants those kinds of reforms to come out of the legislature, and they're just doubling down and saying no.
I had read, Kristen, it actually might have been in the Trib, that we had about $6 billion to make up in this upcoming budget. That Rauner basically said, let's cut it in half. We're going to find $3 billion in cuts, and after that, along with the some portions of the turnaround agenda being implemented, workers' comp reform, then we'll talk about finding $3 billion in revenue somehow. Is that what you heard too?
Yes, I have been told that Rauner has been willing to look at tax increases. And that's really the expansion of the sales tax into services is something he talked about on the campaign trail too. So I think he has been willing to put revenue on the table. But again, you have legislators, you have Democrats who are just unwilling to work with him in any way, shape, or form. They just want him to hang out and dry, and they want him to make all the tough cuts. They're saying on the floor as they were passing these budget bills yesterday that they were kind of, asserting themselves, reminding him that they are a co-equal branch of government. So it looks like a temper tantrum to me. Just sheer laziness too. If we look at the amount of time that legislators are actually in Springfield, they weren't really down there at all in January, maybe a couple days in February. They took 2 weeks off in April. Come on, this is not how you run government, especially when your state is in a fiscal crisis.
And it also seems a bit odd that the same people who the constant attack is, hey, listen, we're not going to bend over for all this pro-business stuff that the governor wants to push through. Then they'll take a breath and talk about how they want to create more jobs for people here in Illinois.
Yes, and I just find all of that kind of ironic because if you look over the course of the last 12, 15 years, when Democrats have been in charge of Springfield, they are the ones courting all of the big tax breaks for Exelon, AT&T, CME Group. So this whole idea that Rauner's pushing this agenda that is somehow helping corporate America is just not true. Ask any small business owner about how much they pay for workers' comp insurance. Our bill that we passed in 2011 didn't go far enough. Everybody knows it, but they're not even willing to give on that.
Kristen McQueary from the Chicago Tribune editorial board, Rockford native, Guilford grad with us, Rauner and Scot on WROK. An op-ed in the Trib today. The other showdown in Springfield we should be aware of. This involves the state's contract with the AFSCME union, and it's being negotiated not through the legislature, but directly with the governor, the governor's office. The editorial runs down some of these demands, and Scott Stancis' cartoon today is just precious. I tweeted it out earlier. You can find it on the Tribune's website. What are some of these demands that the union is making?
Well, the union is basically, the executive director put out a letter to her members to kind of get them riled up. They're going to start demonstrating outside of office buildings in the next few weeks. Rauner has his first move, basically, is that he is asking for a pay freeze, which we say in the editorial, they should be grateful it's not a pay cut, because this is a union who, over the course of the last decade, has gotten consistent and generous raises under Blagojevich. 4-year contract, 15% hike.
Mm-hmm.
Next contract, 4 years, 13% hike, 1 to 2% under Quinn. So, given the state of the state's finances, we don't think it's unreasonable that Rauner is coming out with a pay freeze. But they're of course up in arms about that. He wants to change some of the work rules. You have now supervisors making less than the people below them. 96% of the state workforce is unionized. It creates all kinds of conflicts. People get automatic step increases and promotions and pay increases without having to show performance. So those are some of the things that he wants to change. They get 13 paid holidays, including Election Day. He would like to peel back some of those. They don't want to give on anything.
And what is it? 37.5-hour work week? Is that one of the things as well?
That's right. The union sometime back negotiated a 37.5 work week. So then anything over that, they start getting overtime. And the overtime is offered first to the most senior employees. So it's at the greatest cost to taxpayers. And that really adds up. I mean, the overtime costs just between 3.37 and 5 up to 40 hours. It's a lot. And so Rauner is asking them for a 40-hour work week, which, of course, that's too much.
Kristen McQueary with us from the Tribune. Could this end up in a strike or perhaps even a lockout from the state's perspective?
I don't know that I would predict a strike just yet. The contract ends June 30th. In the past, governors who, Rauner, too, says he's negotiating good faith, they will extend the contract for a few months, while they continue at the bargaining table. So I could see something like that happening. Even under Quinn, it took Quinn about 18 months to get a new contract with AFSCME. But if the governor runs out of patience and just lets the contract expire, then I could see AFSCME getting riled up and doing some sort of walkouts. I don't know that I would see a full strike, but it's possible.
Kristen McQueary with us from the Chicago Tribune editorial board. It's Rauner and Scot here on WROK. And finally, this story by Diane Rado from the past weekend, and the Trib had an editorial on it yesterday. The pension spiking, the districts across the state fattening pensions with these end-of-career salary spikes, not just putting taxpayers on the hook for increased pensions, not just putting local taxpayers on the hook for increased salaries, but also putting local taxpayers on the hook for millions of dollars in penalties, just flat-out penalties paid to the state across the state. It all adds up to millions of dollars, but, well, right here in Rockford, District 205, leading the state in the amount of penalties paid to Springfield, nearly $2 million taxpayer dollars paid for 209 educators to get increased salaries, thus increased pensions, right at the tail end of their career. Kristen, I know this is to you as well. This is an infuriating story.
It is absolutely infuriating. I mean, I'm a big proponent of local control, but this is an area where your locally elected school board is basically throwing taxpayer money out the window at a time when I'm sure your schools could use. I mean, think of how many teachers could have been hired, or aides, or special ed. But instead of that, they're giving retiring teachers and administrators raises of over 6%. I mean, 6% is generous.
Mm-hmm.
And then paying a penalty for it. And a lot of districts have done this and even gotten out from underneath the penalty, so it's even more revenue lost to the state. I mean, it's just, you know, in the 80s and during a lot of the 90s, school boards routinely gave retiring teachers sometimes back-to-back 20 to 25% raises, basically doubling their salaries so that their pensions, you know, they earn 75% of their final salary, usually, if they've put in 30 years. That's what they earn for the rest of their life, and those are, of course, compounded by 3% each year. And finally, the legislature in 2005 stepped in and said, okay, this is getting out of control. If you approve any increases over 6%, you're going to pay a penalty, thinking that it was going to rein in some of that crazy, wild spending, but it hasn't. School districts are just, you know, doing it anyway and then paying a penalty on top of it, including like Rockford and some South suburban districts that are really strapped for cash.
And then, Kristen, some of these boards actually then, took legal action to try to worm their way out of what clearly would be, what clearly qualified for these penalties.
Yeah. I mean, there are already exemptions in the law and exemptions that, you know, the legislators kind of slipped in over the past, since 2005. And yes, districts are, then they're surprised when the State Board of Education comes back and says, oh, by the way, you owe us X amount of dollars, and they're fighting those in court. So it's just, you know, how about we just do reasonable raises when teachers retire and pay them fairly throughout the course of their employment so that we don't have this crazy spiking at the end of their careers.
Kristen McQueary with us. Before we let you go, I mentioned this, we talked about this story earlier in the week. There's a Mike Madigan idea that I actually think is not a bad idea, the local pension accountability for school districts. Right now, pensions are paid by taxpayers throughout the state. And normally I say something like, well, why should Rockford taxpayers be on the hook for what Naperville or Barrington or Wheaton districts promise their teachers and their compensation packages? After this story, though, now we have to ask it in reverse. Why should Naperville taxpayers be on the hook for what Rockford board promises their educators in these packages? But what do you think? Where do you stand on the local pension responsibility, the pension swap, as Mike Madigan calls it? Is that possibly a good idea?
I mean, I think it's a good idea. It's long overdue. Local districts should be responsible for paying for their own retiring teachers. Then they wouldn't be offering these, you know, huge, generous end of retirement salary hikes and then sending the bill to the state. But it's so controversial in Springfield. I mean, the suburban districts just absolutely go up in arms when you talk about taking away or, you know, shifting any more tax burden onto them, because they do pay really high property taxes for their local districts, and it's just not, it's an untenable idea right now in Springfield.
Kristen McQueary, Chicago Tribune editorial board, Rockford native, go Guilford. Thanks for taking time out of your morning for us.
Thanks for having me.